Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to give everything up, to move across the world and start a new life in a different country? What are the challenges of this new way of life? And are the benefits worth the costs? Today, we have author James Balagot on the podcast, here to talk about his new book, Beyond the American Dream, that chronicles his family's move from the Bay Area to Berlin and then Hong Kong, chasing the expat lifestyle. Hi, James. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, Richard. Thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, first off, I love the book. It was so much fun to read and follow along. It starts during COVID, and I think it's the best depiction of COVID I've read because it's just so honest and truthful in your challenges as expats living in a new country. But I don't want to focus on COVID because that's years ago, and I think we're all trying to forget how challenging that was. So I want to start before COVID even started. And you wrote this book about moving abroad to live a different life. And what inspired you to want to live abroad?
Well, exploring and being curious is always something that I've had and my wife has had. Now, I think the twist to it all is living abroad and actually having kids and actually following through it. And that's a completely different story. And actually, I got a bit of my inspiration from a book called The Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath. Have you read it at all?
I'm not, but I'm going to take a note because I love when people share their favorite books or powerful books.
Cool. So it takes a look at taking a deep dive into life's moments. So like the small and meaningful experiences that ultimately makes our life richer. So what the book argues is that rather than having these experiences happen to us, by understanding the power of moments, we can actually create those moments. And so for us, living abroad was a way to surround ourselves and make it easy to have these special moments every day just by doing ordinary things.
I love that. It's, you're making these memories that'll live on with your kids forever and be these stories you tell over dinner tables when they're adults that everyone laughs about, that you don't have those unless you take a chance and go do it.
Yeah. So by living abroad, it's crazy the amount of things that, you get yourself into, and all of a sudden it's something that becomes like a core memory.
Definitely. Now, the title of your book is Beyond the American Dream, which implies you were searching for something you couldn't find at home. Can you maybe talk about what that was?
I guess a good way to start off is just kind of defining what is the American dream. Depending on who you are, it might mean something else. So for me, growing up, the American dream is this belief, this formula that if you work hard, put your head down, follow the path, good things will eventually happen. Now, this is great, but unfortunately, what most people do, or the trap, is following this blindly. So what we didn't want to do is wake up one day and take a look back and think, God, what did we miss out on? Like, what was that all for? And so for us, it was thinking, okay, if we put that American dream aside and the pursuit of it, of trying to achieve more, do more, buy more, and focus on the here and the now, what type of experiences or what kind of life would be leading? And so for us, that was moving abroad and changing our surroundings.
Earlier in the book, you talk about something called an annual life visualization exercise, which I thought was really interesting. Can you maybe describe how you do this and what kind of the outputs you got from this exercise was?
I think this concept of life visualization is something that everybody should do. And it's as simple as pausing and reflecting. Pausing and reflecting to take a look at where have I been, where am I today, and where am I going? Now, there's many ways to go about this process. And for me, it looked like almost like a role play where I put myself in a quiet room and I imagine a scenario where I bump into a friend that I haven't seen in 20 years, a close friend that, we grew apart, and, I bump into him one day And he asked me the question, what have you been up to? And then I answer the question, and I go on for 20 minutes, and I ramble, talk about various details, and I record it, and then I listen to the recording. And by listening to that, I can dig in to figure out, okay, well, what are some of those themes that emerge? What's my life all about? Is this the life that I imagined, or is this even the life, or am I even happy, or where my life is heading? An alternative to this type of exercise is visualizing 20 years into the future, having, bump into your friend again, and then having to answer that same question of, hey, what have you been up to? So the difference here is now I'm taking a look into the future and analyzing the past. But the big difference here is that the story isn't written. So ultimately, it's an opportunity to create the path forward to get there.
It's so powerful, so simple. It's something anyone can do. It doesn't cost any money. And it reminds me of, reading books that talked about people at their end of their life, reflecting back on their life and how they spent their time. And no one ever said, oh, I wish I'd worked more. They all talked entirely about experiences and loved ones and pursuing their passions. And it's easy to get waylaid and get caught up with, oh, everyone's buying a new house, everyone's buying an expensive car, everyone's buying, and kind of get into this lifestyle. And then all of a sudden you realize, oh, who the heck am I? This is not, I do all these things that I don't really care about. And what you described is a really effective way to kind of take stock of this. How did your yearly visualization exercise, how did it change over the years? Was it pretty consistent, or would you have really big changes from year to year?
Yeah. To be honest, not much change from year to year. And I think this is, going back to the American dream where I grew up, where there was a plan of, you work hard, you go to a good school, you get a good job, you get married, you buy a house, you have kids, and, you have a little fun here on the side. But when it comes down to it, we were living that dream. So it was great. You know what I mean? Yeah, work was stressful here and there, but overall, we had it made. And so when looking at the plan year after year, it was a small tweak here or there. Maybe I wanted to pick up a new hobby, or maybe I wanted to, visit a new place. But essentially, it was the same thing. The problem was that when going through the excerpt, I felt like something was missing. Like it felt like something wasn't right. And to your point, Richard, you were saying you don't want to get to the end of the line and think, God, did I miss out on something? And so I was forcing myself to ask those questions and to figure out, okay, well, what is it that's missing? And what can I do now in order to address that before it's too late?
A big concept in the book is time. Near the end, there's a quote from Tuesdays with Morrie. Everybody knows they're going to die, but nobody believes it. If we did, we'd do things differently. And while you're grappling with the decision to move abroad, you talk about time, specifically your children's age, your parents' age, your age. Can you maybe talk a little bit more about how you think about time? Because it's definitely not, the average person who's thinking this way. You have a really different perspective, a refreshing perspective on how important time is.
So first of all, Tuesdays with Morrie, if you or, your listeners have not read it, I've been reading it for 20 years, pick it up once a year, maybe once every other year, and it gets better every single time. So if folks haven't done that, highly recommend it. The thing as humans is that I think we struggle to quantify time. We see it as unlimited. And we have this belief that there's always going to be more of it. That is until we get some sort of a wake-up call. And this wake-up call could be a near-death experience. It could be looking in the mirror and seeing wrinkles on our face. Or, what I've been doing lately is thinking about, okay, doing the math and figuring out how long has it been since my high school graduation. Like it really doesn't matter what it is, but it's a wake up call. It's a realization that time is finite. Now, these instances, what it does is, again, it creates this opportunity to pause and reflect. Yeah, and for us, it was two simple questions of, well, if time is finite, one, how do I want to spend it? And two, who do I want to spend it with? So these simple questions were a guide for us. And ultimately, what it does is, once we've accepted that time is limited, it forces us to take action. Okay, we're going to do something about it.
I love this, James. It's taking me back to my master's, talking about corporate strategy. There's so many parallels in terms of how you look at time, and having to make a decision, and doing nothing is actually a decision. Choosing just to stay on the path is a decision. Often people aren't happy with that decision as they get older, as they deal with illness or infirmity or death of loved ones. Going back to making this big decision, I think that's the hardest part for a lot of people. We all can see the challenges. And one of the things you focus on is, like, the first step is just to say yes. And, to say yes to moving a family abroad, to leaving jobs, to going to a place you don't know. How did you make that decision?
When it comes to doing something, you mentioned earlier this concept of action, taking action. I think we can easily find excuses to do something or to talk ourselves out of something. And for us, this concept of moving abroad isn't something that we had to do unless we had something in order to create urgency to take action with it. And for us, it was rallying around this concept of the golden age of parenting. Richard, have you heard of this at all, or something similar?
My oldest is turning 13 in a couple months. I'm still in the golden age. My youngest is 9, so they love us. They think we're great, but I know there's not much time left where that is like that.
That's exactly what it is, right? Like on the younger end, your kids are out of diapers, but then they're young enough where they're not teenagers, you're full-blown teenagers, where, Richard, you're still their hero. They want to spend time with you. They laugh at your jokes. They think you're unstoppable, and they're adaptable. Like they're great to be around. That doesn't last forever. And so for us, we've got 3 kids, and we've got a much more limited range. And we rallied around this concept of the golden age of parenting, that if we're going to do something, especially with our kids, and this concept of moving abroad, we have to do it now. We have to do it within the next few years. Because once they age out of it, then all of a sudden, this makes things very difficult. It almost reminds me of younger parents ask me, when is the perfect time, or is there a perfect time to take your kid to Disneyland? Like, I grew up in California, so Disneyland was a big thing, and it was kind of like a rite of passage. And believe it or not, there is a right time, right? Like you want to find that point where they know enough about Disney, they've got that background, they've seen the movies, and they get wowed by the experience. You don't want to take them there too young, because then they're just going to get burnt out. They're going to throw a tantrum. They're going to cry. And you don't want to take them too old when they're too old, because they're going to be thinking, where's all the roller coasters? Disneyland is not for that. So for us, we're doing this trip. The kids were in the sweet spot, and it was our excuse for us to say, yes, we're going to do this because we have to do it now.
Two of the biggest challenges in moving abroad are, what do you do for work, and what do you do for kids in the school? There's a different language. Will they be behind? Will they be able to come back home and catch up and be in the U.S. school system and not lose a grade? How did you handle those two issues?
I wish I had all the answers. And sometimes when people look at us from the outside, it's like, wow, you've got it made. You've figured it all out. Well, we were thinking about those two problems that you mentioned in terms of, okay, well, going to school and money. And the initial plan when we was first trying, marinating on this idea was, okay, this is what we're going to do. We're going to save a ton of money, and we're going to script out an itinerary where every 2 weeks we'd go to a new country. And so by the end of a year, we'd see like over 24 countries, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that didn't happen. We didn't save enough money, and we didn't plan. So going back to this concept of excuses, we had to find a solution. And so for us, with my wife being a teacher, we entered the international schools route. So if you're not familiar with this, there's international schools all around the world, and the comp's pretty good. They take care of you in terms of helping you get a visa. They provide an instant community. So you have friends automatically, take care of the schooling issue. And then, of course, there's a job. So it isn't exactly what we envisioned, but I think it worked to our advantage, because rather than moving abroad and constantly be on the go with traveling, it provided us with a hub to settle into that felt like home. And then we could rally around all of the holidays. And as you know, kids have a lot of days off, a lot of weeks here and there. And we were able to take advantage of that fully.
Do you think you could have done this if your wife wasn't a teacher? It seems like that affords, one of the big issues is, these international schools, they're expensive. And so, it can be $20,000 a year per child, where all of a sudden it's not just living expenses. It's now, at least here in Canada, school's free. Parts of Europe, I know in the US it's kind of free, and a lot of kids go to private schools. But could you have had the same experience if you didn't have the benefits of your wife being a teacher?
It would definitely be a different experience. Like if I were to, take a napkin and throw some ideas on there, there's potentially the local route. Depending on the country, they offer English, or if you want to go fully immersive, there's the opportunity to learn a language and go to school there. Right? So that's one. There's the corporate route of, getting a job with the company. There is the idea of traveling within countries where the cost of living is much lower. It would limit the areas that you can go to. But for example, right now, we're in Hong Kong, and there's many countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, where the dollar goes so much further, and you can, travel there for so much longer. So basically what I'm saying, there's ways to go around it. It's definitely not going to be the same experience we have, and it potentially could be better. But again, it's really having the right mentality going in, and being flexible with the situation.
In making the decision to move abroad, this had a really big impact on your extended family. Can you maybe share how you navigated that issue and why it was such a significant part of this decision?
So for us, this move abroad was in line with our priorities. So it was important for us to really clarify what is it that we want, be intentional with our decisions. Unfortunately, to your point, it impacts other people. The one that it impacted the most was when we decided to move, my in-laws were living with us. And what they actually did is they tied their identity, their purpose, their why to raising their grandchildren, our kids. And so they saw the situation with living with us as their forever. So unfortunately, with our decision to move, well, that changed things. And for them, who thought we were living the American dream and we had it made, was very difficult for them to understand, and they just didn't understand our logic. They felt like it just didn't make sense. So that was a tough conversation. It was a challenging situation, but in the end, like, we had to do what we thought was right and what we wanted to do.
Now, you had a house full of stuff that you had to deal with. How did you approach, all these things you'd accumulated? You can't, I guess you could transport a house to wherever you go. It's costly, it's difficult. What option did you folks pursue?
Yeah. So if you've seen the movie Up, it is possible. I've seen it. It is possible. But as we were figuring out the logistics of the move, we realized that we couldn't bring everything with us. So we thought about that. It wasn't going to happen. And so as we were getting into the specifics, we realized that just having more of it was a burden. It slowed us down. So we'd have to answer questions. Okay, what do we keep? What do we ship versus leave? Where do we store it? And if we store it, is someone going to steal it? Like, how do we maintain it? How do we protect it? It's just something that we didn't want to worry about. So by having less, it just simplified our lives and it gave us less to worry about. The other thing that I think we had going for us is we were leaving for 2 years. We were leaving for 2 years. And based on where our kids were at, when we were leaving at 4, 7, and 9, when we came back home, our needs would change, right? We'd grow out of it. So the home that we were leaving would not be the home we needed when we came back, just because of where the kids are at. And so that provided it made it easier for us to get rid of this stuff than rather to keep it or have to deal with it.
You eventually got down to, I think, 2 bags per person. And you talk in the book about this idea of like enforced minimalism. And one thing I kind of resonated with me is there's a point you're agonizing. Should you keep it? Should you get rid of it? What should you do with it? And you get rid of it. And the next day it's like, like you'd never had it. It didn't bother you at all. So many people, our houses are full of just so much stuff. Can you maybe talk about just the feeling of getting rid of stuff?
I'll talk about 2 pieces. One, I'll talk about, what that experience is like, and then the benefit. On the first side, it reminds me of a time when my son had a hammer that, and you've probably seen these things. You'd bang them around and they make these squeaky sounds. And he was 3 at the time. And this thing was annoying. It just drove me insane. Well, what would any good parent do? I hid it. So I hid it, and then he threw a tantrum. But 10 minutes later, he forgot about it and moved on to a different toy, and he never brought it up again. And I think it's similar to adults. Maybe the recovery time takes a little bit longer, but it's essentially the same thing, right? We think we need these things, but then you take it away, and then maybe a week goes by, and you move on. It didn't really matter that much.
In the book, it's you make a point about how easily your children adapted to this new life as you went traveling, went to new cities. But during the planning phase, your worries about how your kids would adapt was one of your biggest concerns. Can you talk about just like the surprise at how easily your kids just ran with this and like dealt with it?
Yeah, I was surprised and I wasn't surprised. Thing that I've noticed about kids is they want to know what's going on, but they don't need to. Thing about kids is they only need to know a certain amount to be happy. And then all of a sudden it goes through one ear and out the other, and then you're drowning them with details. And so a big part, as you mentioned, of the book is timing. And so because of where the kids were at 4, 7, and 9 years old, they were adaptable, right? Like yes, they had friends at home. Yes, um, they had their stuff that they were a part of, but because of their age, they could change with the situation. So I think that was a big piece. So if for anybody that's considering a move abroad or change, like, you have to be and have the right mindset. And if you have the right mindset, it's going to solve 90% of the problems. The second benefit that we had to help the children is that we have a big family. They're a big family by today's American standards, right? Like, by having a family unit of 5, it provides a buffer for everything else. So even though we were in a new environment, the fact that it was mom and dad and the 3 kids, that didn't change, right? We were still speaking the same language. We were still communicating the same way. We would still spend time together. So regardless of what was happening in the world around us, we could rely on each other to be the constant. And that made things so much easier. So just even thinking about the kids, because we had the right mentality of what we were doing abroad, and they were at the right age, it made this whole process easier. And I was shocked when I actually asked them later, like, did you ever get homesick? And even myself, I started thinking, did I get homesick? And we've been on this thing for 5 years, and no, right? Like, we don't get homesick, which is a weird phenomenon, because I remember being in college in my first year, and I was getting homesick like within my first month. And here are these kids that are relatively young, and they weren't getting homesick at all, and we're in a completely foreign environment, which made me realize how important that family unit is. And of course, as parents, what we need to, how important that tone we need to set for everybody else.
Many people look at the expat lifestyle and they have their own perception of what the benefits are. But for your experience, what are the big benefits of this lifestyle you've been on for the better part of the last 5 years?
So in no particular order, I'm just going to riff off here. Benefit number 1, social obligations. So we talked a little bit earlier about having a big family, and the big family that I had, there was something going on every weekend, both Saturday and Sunday. It could be a baptism, could be someone's birthday, could be a wedding, could be piano recital. You pick it. There's always something, and it's not bad necessarily, these events, but it just made it busy, and you had to show up. You had to be present. So by living abroad, all of a sudden you cut out all those obligations, right? There's nothing to attend, and all of a sudden you have to get creative with what you're going to do on your weekend. What are you going to do to spend your time? And it forces you to get out there. I think the second one that comes to mind is by being abroad, I know it's not forever. Right, like there's this concept when you're home. For us, it's in California. California is an amazing place, but I didn't realize how great California was until I left the place. Right, because everything from Highway 1 to the Sierras to Lake Tahoe to parts of San Francisco, to some of the national parks like Death Valley, the John Muir Trail, so many of these things, I never bothered to visit because I always knew it was going to be there. It's like, I'll eventually get to it. And then that's something when I have time to do. So I never did it. When you're living abroad, this concept of time being finite becomes much more real. So if you're going to be living abroad, maybe it's going to be for 6 months, 3 months, a year. Maybe you're only going to be in a city for 1 week. All of a sudden, there's this sense of urgency of, okay, how are we going to spend this time? We got 1 week in this city. What are we going to do? We're probably not going to come back. So let's get it all done. And I think that's probably the biggest benefit of it. It forces you, in a good way, to make the most of your time. And to be frank, like, there's so many different cities, so many places to visit. Like, you can pick any one, but it really comes down to, again, the mindset and the mentality going in of, I've got a finite amount of time. How can I be intentional with it, with the activities that I'm doing, the experiences that I'm having? Why should I waste it worrying and not being happy? I need to enjoy it. So by being abroad and being in that situation, it creates that environment to have that mindset.
And just, what I'm hearing as a father is you remove all these distractions, and whether or not it's family commitments or scouts or sports or play dates or school forms or all these things that end up meaning you never have this time together. You have these little brief moments as a family. In what you're doing living abroad, it's not just an hour here or a half hour there. It's days or weeks of this time where you can kind of bond as a family, build these relationships, and then have these shared experiences, which end up as the photos that'll be on your kids' walls when they're old, and they'll look at them and they'll smile, and they'll have these, great memories of the time they spend, as a family, which I think is almost every parent's goal, is, to give their children a happy and meaningful childhood, which just seems so powerful in terms of what you're doing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, especially around the expectations piece. And so by being abroad, and it doesn't necessarily need to be abroad, but if one can distance themselves from expectations of what you're supposed to do, of what you have to do, or what's expected of you, and pausing and thinking of, okay, well, what do we want to do, and how can we take ourselves out of kind of that pressure cooker? Then it's exciting about what kind of experiences or what life is possible.
What are some of the challenges of living abroad, or what are some of the challenges you've experienced?
I think for any situation, it really comes down to what kind of a meaning that you assign to it. So, for example, one of these is you don't have the comfort of home or the routines that you're used to. Okay, so for example, I'm a huge fan of In-N-Out. There's no In-N-Out in Berlin. But what it does is it forces me to think, okay, well, what can I eat instead of In-N-Out? What other foods can I experiment with? And so it gets you out of that comfort zone. So you can see it as a bad thing, where it's like, okay, I'm not eating In-N-Out, but okay, I'll try a new restaurant, or I'll try a new experience. The other one, I think that's big, especially with kids, is it's a very transient community, especially in these expat communities that we're a part of, where people are constantly coming in and people are constantly going. So downside is you can't get too attached to anybody. When someone leaves, you have to accept it, and you have to move on. And then there's other friends that you're going to have to make. So that could be a negative thing, but there's a positive side to it where, right, like you're meeting a lot of people, and for the people that you really want to stay in contact with technology today, you can. I think the hardest part for us was on the communication side when it comes to living abroad, where just take for granted how powerful language is in order to get your way, of how to express yourself. And when being in a foreign country and you're put in a situation where you have to take care of paperwork or something of that nature, things take 10 times longer. So there needs to be patience for some of these logistical things. So it happens, but it's not all that bad. I think if I were to put one more downside is that change is constant. But it doesn't have to be. So when we talk about change, it is the changes to a new lifestyle, changes of how you're getting groceries, changes of how you're getting around, changes of the people that you interact with, changes of the living environment or how you pay for bills. All these things that we take for granted that are part of our routines. And so that takes some time to get used to. Or, again, you can see it as an experience that has its benefits.
In the book, what comes across is this acceptance of adversity, and even your answer to the last question kind of reflects this. Yeah, there's uncertainty, there's change, there's bad things happen that need to be dealt with. And my experience is just dealing with adversity and accepting it makes travel so much more fun. We've all seen the person screaming because the flight is delayed at the gate agent. Most rational people know nothing. The flight's not going to get there any quicker. When things go wrong, they just kind of go wrong. You got to figure out the best way to solve them and move forward. But can you maybe share a little bit more detail about how you approach traveling with kids and all these things that can go wrong, that as a parent, your energy can go into the kids and they can get really upset? It didn't seem like that happened, to you. And I think part of it's just your approach to traveling.
I wish we never lost our cool. I wish everything. I wish we never lost our cool. I wish when the unexpected happened, we quickly breezed through it. But it wasn't always the case. There's an instance in the book where I talk about traveling during COVID. So during this time, there were a lot of rules being put in place that would happen overnight. And a lot of them weren't clear. I didn't understand them. There was documentation on it, but who knows if people were going to apply it. And so when we were living in Berlin, when we were traveling over to Greece for, I think it was the October holiday, they wouldn't have let us board the plane because we didn't submit papers in it or 24 hours in advance. And I remember just being shocked, right? Like, because we didn't submit this paperwork, and even though we could submit it then, they would not let us on the plane. And we just lost it. We lost it for a good 30 minutes. I'm not proud of it, but I yelled at our kids. We needed the space. We were in tears. Got punched in the face. But I think, to your point, that there's nothing we can do about it. It is what it is, and we've got to move on. And we've learned to accept it, regroup, and really focus on, okay, what are our options? And going back to a point I said before was, okay, we've got to create meaning out of it. Now, looking at that experience, I think it's one of those things that I talk about. It's one of the things that people actually want to hear about, because people don't want to hear, and people don't remember when everything goes right. People want to know about that adversity, or, okay, what happened? How did you react to it? How did you adjust to it? And I think we've had so many of those, especially during COVID, especially living abroad, that anytime something new happens, it's kind of like, oh, we've seen this before. Okay, this isn't quite as bad as when we were in Iceland. Okay, we can handle this. What did we do then? Okay, let's try option A and B, and if that doesn't work, we'll move on to C, and then we move on.
I think you said something that's I hadn't really thought about it, but a lot of our strongest memories are these things when things went wrong, and then somehow we got through it. And, looking back, these horrible things at the time, which were really challenging, become a source of bonding. The people you were with, you got through a really challenging or a dangerous situation. And they do become a big part of who we are and how we travel in the future. Oh, I got through that. I can get through this now. I think that's a really good point. And I guess that leads to the last question. What have you learned, about yourself, about parenting, or what tips can you share about traveling and living abroad that, other people might find useful?
I don't know if I'm using this term correctly, but I like the term. It's called, when people say a zero-sum game. I don't think that there's winners and losers here, right? I think everybody can be a winner. I think when it comes down to it, there isn't a right decision. I think that there's plenty of great decisions. I think the important piece in all this, of this experience, is the first is to pause and reflect. Again, the title of the book is Beyond the American Dream, and it is really taking a look at what if we stop doing what everybody expected us to do, or what everybody expects the life that we should lead, and why don't we stop and pause and really be intentional about the life that we want moving forward. So I think that's lesson number one. And for us, it was living abroad, but I don't think it's for everybody. I think the second idea that I want to push is, now I didn't invent this, but are you familiar, Richard, with the term memento mori?
Yes. My brain's not working. I forget. It's you'll say, oh yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah. So memento mori is the phrase, remember that you will die.
Yes.
And it was used by Stoics, but recently popularized by Ryan Holiday. And we all know that we're going to die, but we don't really believe it. It's the same quote, something similar in the Tuesdays with Morrie book. And I think if anybody, I think the biggest thing that I can share with folks is just remember that time is finite. And going back to that previous point, it's, we've got to act that way. We need to understand that time is finite. We need to be intentional with our actions. And I think we're going to live a much more fulfilling life. And when, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 30 years from now, we're going to be proud of the decisions that we made along the way. One last idea is really around the mindset. And we've talked about this concept a couple times throughout this conversation, the mindset of getting out there and going on an adventure. I think we're surrounded by opportunities in order to create moments, in order to have experiences that are beyond the ordinary. I think we just need to have that mindset or take that approach, and all of a sudden every day can be that. But if we settle into a routine too often, then all of a sudden time is going to fly by and we're going to wonder what happened. And that's what I don't want for anybody. I don't want anybody going 10, 20, 30, 40 years into the future and think, God, what did I do? Is this the life that I wanted? It's better to ask that question now and take actions now that will lead to the life and have you leading the life that you want.
James, what a great way to end the podcast. If people want to find the book, and once again, it's a great read. It's really interesting. Lots of life lessons. And, I find looking how other people approach decisions and seeing the results, really effective for me to kind of think about these topics in a way that just reading the words maybe isn't as powerful. Where can people find you or find the book?
So you can pick up the book, Amazon. You can get the digital version or the the print. I was surprised that more people prefer print over digital. I've been asked to do an audiobook version with the kids reading portions of it, but that I think that's going to come sometime in the future, long-term time future. Is a pretty cool idea. And then I also keep a personal blog called Purposefully Lost on Substack. So I send out an edition once a week to give an idea of, what are those moments from the week, some thoughts about what's top of mind. And I love running. I love getting out there. So I talk about my weekly run adventures and workouts. So if you're into that kind of thing, I encourage you to search for Purposefully Lost on Substack.
I'll put links to both of those in the show notes. And I want to say thanks for coming on the show today, James, and sharing your story. It was really great to hear.
Yeah, it was a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me, Richard.
And thanks to all of you that are listening to this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a like or a comment. And we'll be back next week to explore the world and hear about more epic adventures on the 10 Adventures podcast. Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.